We interrupt this program. Purim is a little more than 5 weeks away, so forgive me for talking about Esther and Mordecai, and especially Ahasuerus, a little bit early. I'll get to them in a minute. But I recently met with a gentleman named Kaimers Datwala, and he is the founding member of the Zoroastrian Association of Houston. According to Wikipedia, there are less than 200,000 Zoroastrians in the entire world. We thought we had small numbers. About 15,000 of them live in the United States, and of those, about 1,000 live here in Houston. I showed Kaimers our synagogue, some of the artifacts in our museum, our prayer spaces, and then we sat and talked for a while about our different faith traditions. Since I've been teaching the Invitation to Judaism class for decades now, I'm very well aware that someone interested in learning about Judaism can find lots of information on the internet or in books, and that's a good source of information if you go to the right books and the right websites. But reading about Judaism and learning about Judaism from a Jewish person who's living a Jewish life are really not the same thing. So it's really helpful to talk with a real person to really understand what's in their world. Anyway, it turns out that our faith traditions, Judaism and Zoroastrianism, have a lot in common. We also have some differences, of course. I don't want to go into the details right now this evening because I'm hoping that people who are interested in learning more, a little bit curious, will come Sunday morning here at Beth Yeshurun this Sunday at 11 o'clock to hear Mr. Datwala give us a presentation about his faith. But the conversation I had with him made me stop and think. Zoroastrians have historically been pretty good to the Jewish people. Cyrus the Great was the king of Persia, founder of the Achaemenid Empire, and famously issued the order to allowing the Jewish people to return to Israel and to rebuild the city of Jerusalem and to build the temple and worship God as we pleased. That's no small matter. Only some 50 years after we had been taken into exile by the Babylonian Empire, the Persian Empire conquered the Babylonians, and then Cyrus, out of the blue, seemingly, issued this decree allowing us to return. The prophet Isaiah gave Cyrus the title God's Messiah, God's Anointed One, because our belief is that God inspired Cyrus to issue that order. The Persians even helped to pay for rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. Imagine that. I used to think that the reason Cyrus issued that order was so that our God would look kindly on the Persian Empire and therefore protect it from its enemies. And that may be partly true. But contrary to what I was told when I was young, Zoroastrians claim to be monotheists, which means that Cyrus most likely believed that we worship the same God. Now, I know that many of you may have heard, as I heard earlier, that Zoroastrianism is a dualistic religion, believing in two divine beings, a good God and a bad God. But as Kaimers will explain to us on Sunday, they really believe in only one God, Ahura Mazda. They call the Lord of Wisdom. That kind of resonates with us, right? The God who gave us the Torah, wisdom, their Lord, wisdom. But they also acknowledge two competing principles representing good and evil. Spenta menu, I'm going to butcher these terms. Spenta menu, meaning bounteous spirit, and angra menu, meaning destructive spirit. So humans, according to Zoroastrians, are intimately involved in this struggle, holding off chaos and destruction through active goodness. And if this idea sounds familiar, it's because in our tradition, we say that human beings are caught in a struggle between our good intentions, our Yetzer HaTov, and our not so good intentions, our Yetzer Hara. But we can ask Kaimers more about this on Sunday. I just wanted to point out that King Cyrus may truly have been inspired by God, as he himself understood it. and in a way, as we understood it. So the Zoroastrian king of the Persian Empire sends us home, helps us rebuild the temple, and we don't often talk about the fact that probably most Jews apparently didn't return to Israel. They stayed in Persia. After all, we'd been living there for 2 generations maybe. We had jobs, we had homes, we knew the language, we made friends, life was comfortable. You know, kind of like why we're still here in Texas instead of Tel Aviv. And then comes the Queen Esther story. Bible scholars are not confident in the historical details that we read in the book of Esther. To me, it reads like a vaudeville comedy. I mean, Groucho Marx couldn't have written a funnier story. So at least as I read it, it's not really intended to describe the historical facts. But be that as it may, Bible scholars nevertheless try to pinpoint which Persian king is the one the book of Esther calls Ahasuerus. And the majority of them agree that the king referred to in Esther is Xerxes, who happened to be the grandson of Cyrus. For those of you who saw the movie 300, anybody see the movie 300? Okay, nobody's into war movies here? All right, anyway, all right. That movie was about a famous battle between 300 Spartans and perhaps hundreds of thousands of Persian soldiers. And the king of Persia in that battle was Xerxes. That was his battle, the Battle of Thermopylae. Anyway, notwithstanding the international conflict, what we have in the story of Esther is another story of a relationship of Jews living in Zoroastrian Persia. And yes, Haman is the archetype anti-Semite, hating all the Jews because he was jealous of Mordecai. By the way, the book of Esther says Haman is an Agagite. And in tradition, that means he was not even Persian. He was a descendant of the king of the Amalekites, a completely different people who have hated the Jews for centuries. Anyway, there is that negative aspect of the story. But it's also about the Persian king, Xerxes, who supported his queen and her people, the Jews. Again, a Zoroastrian ruler giving aid and comfort and support to the Jewish people. So the story of Esther would have taken place about 2,500 years ago or so. More recently, only 1,500 years ago, about 1,000 years after the story of Esther, the Jewish community is still living in Persia, and they're still doing really well. And when Jews in Israel were struggling under Byzantine Roman rule, the Jews in Persia under Zoroastrian Sassanid Empire are thriving. As you know, we Jews study the Talmud. But which one do we study? Which one are we talking about? There's actually 2 Talmuds. One that was written and edited in Israel that we usually call the Jerusalem Talmud, and then one written in Persia that we usually call the Babylonian Talmud. Now, I think we call it the Babylonian Talmud partly because we were so traumatized by the Babylonian exile that happened more than 1,000 years before that. But the fact is that Babylon, in the time of the Talmudic rabbis, was part of the Persian Sassanid Empire. So we probably ought to call it the Persian Talmud or the Sassanid Talmud. In any case, the Jewish community thrived in the Sassanid Empire. We had an exilarch who was sort of a Jewish governor. We had several Talmudic academies. And one reason we generally study the the Babylonian Talmud, and not the Jerusalem Talmud, is that the community in Persia was doing so much better. They had more time and resources to study, to comment, and to finally edit the text. They were able to spread their teachings throughout the Jewish world. So Judaism evolved in Zoroastrian culture for over 1,000 years. No doubt, we adapted some of our practices and ideas based on what we learned there, just as we adapted what we learned from the Greeks and the Romans. And by the same token, we probably influenced Persian culture in some ways. We certainly had an influence on Western civilization as well. Mr. Dodwalla will give his presentation Sunday morning at 11 o'clock on Zoroastrianism, the tradition and faith of his people. I hope you'll be able to join me, and maybe we can arrange to visit their center on West Airport in Gessner. And this Purim, as we read the book of Esther, let's remember all the great Zoroastrians who helped the Jewish people in times of need. Of course, we can still make noise to drown out Haman, the bad guy. We're certainly not unaware that there are people out there who hate Jews. The past few years have tragically been a painful reminder of that. But there are also people who act with kindness and fairness, and I think we should spend at least as much time and effort remembering them. Shabbat Shalom.